I loved working with kids because when you get a little kid before the age of 8 or 9, before they've made this big decision about who they are, and, about age 9 or 10, kids they go, "That's who I," and they make this internal decision that I'm gonna be a slow learner, I'm not gonna do this or that. So if I can get in before then, or even, much later too, is like you can flip that. So their self-image is much more intact.
We are back with Dr. Books talking about her incredible work, and I'm curious as we think through people who they're learning again. They're learning about whether it's through social media, the news, a relative, a friend, someone that's got a diagnosis of ADHD. Some people maybe have a desire that they want to fix this thing within them, or that it could or should be fixed, and and maybe that isn't necessarily the case. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, and how you would, I guess, take that conversation from someone who brought that to you. How would you expand upon it?
Well, that's a really good question, and a big one, because when for the years that I worked with children, I would take the parents aside and say, "I'll only work with your child if you're willing to see them in a new light. You have to be able to look for differences and not you can't use your old eyes and see them the same way they've always done, because then they're gonna fall back to what that's what you expect of them." So, our expectations as adults are really important for how the teacher, what effect the teacher has on a child. There was a study done, probably 40 or 50 years ago, where they on purpose, they told one teacher that the IQs of the children were very high, but they weren't, they were just normal kids.
Mm.
And another teacher, they said just the opposite. These kids are, they were they were very, very smart, but they were told they were just in the normal classroom. At the end of the year, the kids exactly lived up to the teacher's expectations.
Mm.
And so, what whether you're the boss, or you're talking to yourself, or you're talking to your kids, how you view the thing is like, there's nothing to be fixed, because there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you. We all, are like snowflakes. We have these places where we sparkle, and there are places where we're not so hot. And nobody's good in all of them. But to find out where you're really good, which is like if you've done the Kolbe Index or something, you find out, or the Strength Finder, you find out these are my superpowers. This is what I do well. These are not, doesn't mean that I have to fix them. It means they're not my strong suit. I have other things that people who not so good at this area, they're good at something I'm not. They're not good at something I'm good at. So, I think it behooves us to really know ourselves, and we have to accept ourselves. When I'm working on people, because I've been through hell and back in my own life, and a lot of abuse and a lot of other stuff, but because I came through it, it's like when we're working, like, my heart is saying to your heart, "Listen, kid or guy, I know you've got what it takes." I just love them through it. And so you just see what is not nothing that you say, it's this this total acceptance of who they are and who they could be, that they don't know who they can be yet, and sometimes you don't know either, but you just hold out for them. There's something really special is in there. So there's nothing about fixing, but it is about allowing.
I can see that. I was having a conversation with someone just the other day. Actually, it might have been right after we finished a recording, and they had their Colby, and they were a 9 initiating fact finder on the Colby Index. I'm like, "Oh, that's a pretty high fact finder. That sounds very interesting." And she'd indicated, I'm not sure if my Colby's right. I've had some people tell me I should do it again. Well, I said, "Well, do you mind if I ask you a few questions?" So we went through a bit of a questioning process, and it turns out she agreed that yes, it is all correct and based on everything that we went through. But I had her do the exercise of writing her name, signing her name with her dominant hand. And then I said, "Okay, here's the fun part. Now I need you to switch hands and do it all over again." And we did it on a Zoom call, so I couldn't see the piece of paper, but the noticeable look of physical frustration on her face, and the whole physical demeanor was a complete change, and it took her about 3 times as long to do it. And she was
Yes.
laughing, but it was almost like a nervous laughter because, we have that, like, it's an uncomfortable feeling, and it was such a really good experience for her, and we had a great conversation about it. So if anyone's watching, if you haven't done that, write your name with your dominant hand, take a pause, take a break, and then on the same piece of paper, switch hands and do it the other way, and notice how you feel. That's the impact of working against your natural instincts.
That's a really good example.
And
Mhm.
it's a visceral physical reaction as well as a mental one. And so if you think about that, and I think about, the people with, ADD, ADHD, these types of things, and so they often, and it's not always the case, but often there's physical connection or response to things. And I think that they feel things often in a very different way physically than other people do. And so I think if people are able to identify at an earlier age what their Kolbe Index is, which
Yes.
is not about
Mhm,
personality, but about instinct. And if you know what that
mhm.
instinct level is, it allows you to, for lack of better terminology, I'll say double down on what already works.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'll say, with people, a lot of times if they're really, really good at math, they may or may not be good at spelling or something else. But I say you don't have to be brilliant at it. You just have to be good enough to get by.
Mhm.
So like if it doesn't mean that you have to really play all the octaves of the piano. You just have to know if your math is not your strong suit, you just have to know you're not going to get shortchanged when you get your change back. You have to know like basic concepts and stuff. So, and there's a Colby for kids too, isn't there?
There's a Kolbe Youth, and
Yeah.
they recommend, doing it at around age, 10 as as the earliest, but,
Mhm.
hugely advantageous. There is some reading comprehension and stuff necessary to take it, and you get the
Yeah.
same color bars, but they don't put the numbers on them, so it doesn't look like a score because people see numbers and they relate it to a score, and so they just use the color bars, which is really smart. And, I
Hmm.
know for myself, I've thought frequently about this, which is one of the reasons I chose to go become Colby certified as a consultant is, in 2013 when I got the Kolbe Index for myself personally, it was a real revolution for me, and it finally put
Oh,
words it put
mhm.
words to explain the things that I already knew to be true, and the way that I created, we talked about those shortcuts that you develop over time. I had done those, but this helped me understand them. And I'll tell you one of the key things, and you may resonate with this, Dr. Books, is that I was always told throughout my life at various stages that, you shouldn't multitask. Multitasking, you need to focus on one thing at one time. And I'm like, okay, well, that makes sense, sure. But I never was able to do that fundamentally. And the Colby Index for me was the first time it said, you're designed to multitask. You should be doing that. I'm like, oh, really? Wow. That makes sense. And one of the things I always come back to for myself, my Colby Index is a 3386. So I have the final bar is about implementers of physical space and tangible world. So I'm a very physically engaged individual. I like tools. I own a lot of them. And it said that one of the things that I should start my day with is a not doing list versus a to doing list.
Oh, interesting.
And that
Yeah.
made such immediate sense to me that I couldn't even describe it to another human being how important that one thing was. I'm like, well, that's perfect. That's exactly what I need. And I had this conversation with someone else recently who, theirs would indicate that they need to start their day zoning in on their absolute top priorities. I'm like, the reason those things are different is because the way we solve problems is different.
Those are great examples. My son, there's a disc, which is another profile, and my son is a multitasker too. And actually, it would drive me crazy. He loves having like 7 different really complex, tape problems on the table. That he just shines. It would drive me nuts, but that's where he's most comfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's good to know it's good to know your strengths, and it's good, to know the strengths of the people that you're working with so that you bring out the best in each other instead of harassing each other.
Yeah, and I think that goes to hand in hand to something you mentioned earlier. You talked about expectations and having clarity on those expectations and being able to make sure that we're not oversetting them necessarily. And it's easy to have too much expectation of another relative to what
Oh,
your own bar is. And I think that's where we start to see, especially in young kids, there's a striving that happens, and sometimes they're striving again now against they're striving against someone else's bar, not their own bar.
I don't want to stereotype. However, dyslexia is much much more common in boys than girls. It's not, it is both places. But one of the biggest problems I have is with daddy who also had it.
Mm,
And he says the same mean things to his son that the teacher said to him. And
mm,
totally counterproductive. But because he has not owned or he transfers that pain onto his son instead of healing his own issues.
mm. I can see that. Very interesting. I'm glad you shared that, and I think that's a great lesson for our listeners to, again, maybe they know someone that's been their experience. I know growing up, it wasn't common to hear much about dyslexia. I can't think of any particular, kid that I knew that had that. But in retrospect, I probably think, maybe there's a degree of which to which I've had it, and I just never noticed before, and maybe it manifested a little bit differently. And so I'm really aware that. We're always constantly sharpening the saw and whittling away at the stick that's carving us into the best version of ourselves.
I like the way you say that. I like that.
Uh,
Yeah.
It, it,
Yeah,
it-
we are being constantly whittled, and we can go willingly and something, but there's a great masterpiece in there. Just, whittle away until you get down to the really, like Michelangelo, you carve away everything that wasn't David, and then David's in there.
yeah, absolutely incredible.
Yeah, you can't give up on David, and even though he's not pretty obvious, especially when you're working with kids or an employee who is just difficult, and you go, "I know there's a David in there somewhere."
Well, we're going to carve away at more of that when we come back from this next commercial break.
If you really understood, like, your body loves you so much, it does so much stuff for you without ever knocking your door and say, "Listen, buddy, you're overtaxing this." It just goes in there and it keeps helping you. When you realize how much work it's doing on your behalf, if you would treat it like your best friend or your little kid, you would be so much nicer to yourself